The day the silence returned. You can't remember the end of a thing without first remembering what it was like before it began, and before the silence returned. There was noise, not just the kind that rattles your bones or drowns out thought, but the quieter kind, the ordinary kind. The clinking of cups in the kitchen, the heavy breath of my father as he shaved each morning, the creak of our wooden floorboards when my mother tried to wake us without waking the whole house. That's the kind of noise I used to know, and long before I wore a uniform. I was just a boy, chasing crickets through tall grass, counting trains that never stopped in our town, listening to the world like someone who still believed he could grow up without having to defend it. The field behind our house, there was a narrow hill. Nothing much, just a bump of earth between two fences, but to me, it was the edge of the world. On windy days, it would hum like a soft instrument, the grass moving in waves like green music. I remember once lying there, his hands behind my head, watching the clouds drift slow and proud across the sky. I was maybe 9 or 10, and the world had not yet told me about grief. There was no uniform then, no boots, no orders, bare feet, and the distant voice of my mother calling me home for supper. It's that voice. It had a warmth that I'd later tried to find in radios, in whispers behind sandbags, and in letters I never got to send. 2. My father's tools. My father was not a soldier. He fixed clocks. His hands were slow, deliberate, and sure. He used to say, every tick has a purpose. Even when it sounds broken to you, it's counting something. I didn't understand him then, but those words stayed with me long after the ticking turned into bombs, and the only thing that seemed to count anymore was time left at night. I'd hear the sound of his tiny screwdrivers turning inside a watch, the scraping of metal against metal, gentle and precise. And in the silence that followed, he would sigh, not out of exhaustion, but because he'd restored something that was meant to keep going. I think that's why I joined the war when they called, because deep down, I thought I might help fix something too. 3. The coat I grew into when I turned 13. My grandfather gave me his old military coat. He didn't speak much about the war he fought in, just said, don't ever let a uniform decide who you are. It was too big for me, of course. The sleeves swallowed my hands, and the collar scratched my neck like sandpaper. But I wore it every time it got cold, imagining that it held some kind of strength. Not kind you see in movies, the quiet kind. Strength that lets you hold your breath when someone you love is walking away. Strength that lets you write letters without knowing if anyone will write back. Strength that stays even when everything else leaves. I wore that coat long before I earned one of my own, and by the time I did, the cold had changed its shape. 4. The radio that taught me the world. We had a radio the size of a shoebox, perched on top of the cupboard. It buzzed more than it sang, but we listened anyway, especially at night. I remember the first time I heard the name of a city I had never seen, Paris. It sounded like velvet and perfume and music, like a place people fell in love with themselves. My brother and I would sit beneath the cupboard, imagining soldiers, marches, flags we couldn't picture. Back then, war was still an idea, a thing that happened far away, a thing of trumpets and medals, maps and mustaches. We had no idea that war doesn't march in with a trumpet. It slips in like a whisper, steals the sound from your everyday life. V. The letter I didn't know I was writing. I started keeping a journal when I was 15. At first, it was just scraps of things. What I saw on my walk home, the smell of old books at the market, a girl with a red ribbon who smiled at me once, nothing big, nothing urgent, but looking back, it was my first attempt at memory. My first quiet rebellion against forgetting. I didn't know it then, but I was already preparing for silence, preparing to remember things in case no one else did. I think everyone does this, even if they don't call it a journal. Some keep memories in photographs, some in recipes, some in habits too small to notice until they're gone. The sound of a fourth are sounds that never come back, not because they disappeared, but because you did. The clatter of your mother's shoes down the hallway when she's late for work. The way your brother clears his throat before asking for something he's embarrassed about. The exact rhythm of the gate when it slams shut. War didn't steal those from me. Time did, but war. War taught me how to miss them. How to ache for the sound of spoons being stirred. How to dream of door hinges, of faucet drips, of someone humming while folding laundry. There is nothing louder than the sound of something you know you'll never hear again. 7. The day the noise changed. Remember the morning the noise changed. I was 17. It was Sunday. The baker's son had just gotten engaged. Someone had found a dog wandering near the schoolhouse. Everything felt normal till the sirens came. We didn't understand them at first. They were shrill, irregular, not like drills we'd heard in stories. They sounded wrong, like the sky had a sore throat. My father turned off the radio. My mother set the plates down too carefully. My grandfather sat in his old chair, his hands folded like he already knew. And I looked at the sky and realized I'd never seen it so still. Even the birds had stopped. 8. The sound of doors closing in the days that followed. The town changed, not with guns, not with flags, but with doors. One by one, shops didn't open, curtains stayed drawn. Conversations moved to whispers, and then silence, not the gentle kind. Not yet. This was the silence of waiting, of tight throats, of clocks ticking louder than they should. I went to the field behind our house, the one that used to hum with wind, and I lay there again, but it didn't hum. It listened like it was bracing itself. 9. Before the first silence, people think war begins with a bang, but mine began with the absence of noise I loved. It began when the bakery stopped smelling like bread, when the boy who sold newspapers left and didn't come back, when the school bell stopped ringing, when mothers packed bags with hands they didn't want to see shaking, when laughter disappeared without a funeral. Before the first shot, for the first order, before the first goodbye, there was the first silence, and in it we all heard our childhood ending, the day they called me soldier. Some days don't begin with the sun rising, okay? They begin with something being taken. That's how the day felt, the day they called me a soldier. They didn't ask. They didn't look into my eyes long enough to wonder who I had been before. They just said, "You're needed, okay?" And suddenly, I was no longer the boy who ran barefoot through wheat fields, okay? I was a name on a list, a coat in a row, a new silence, marching toward a louder one. The envelope on the tablet arrived, folded, cream-colored, stamped and sealed, too official to ignore. I didn't open it at first. I stared at it for hours. My name was written so carefully that it almost felt personal, like it had been addressed by someone who knew how often I still talked in my sleep, who knew I still tied my shoes the wrong way, who knew I had never hit anyone in my life, not even in jest. But it wasn't personal. It was protocol. Inside, a letter told me where to go, what to bring, what to become. And I remember thinking, this is the last letter I'll ever open while knowing who I am. 2. My mother's quiet goodbye. She didn't say the word goodbye. She never did. Instead, she packed my bag twice. Once for what I needed, and once for what I'd miss. A pair of thick socks she had knitted in spring, a ribbon from the girl next door. Tucked between pages of a book, a tiny glass vial with lavender seeds, and the smallest wooden spoon from her kitchen drawer. I still don't know why she didn't cry Not then. Instead, she made breakfast like she always did. The smell of eggs and coffee, trying so hard to hold back time. I chewed slowly. She wiped the same spot on the counter again and again. We said nothing, but the silence between us had weight. It held love and fear and something unspoken. We both knew I wasn't coming back the same. 3. What I packed and what I left behind: my packed socks, matches, a pencil, a journal. I left behind the sound of my brother's footsteps on the stairs, the warmth of sunlight filtered through our window curtains, the quiet safety of being someone unnecessary. No one tells you this, but going to war isn't just leaving home. It's leaving yourself, the version of you that didn't yet know what the inside of loss feels like. The version that still laughed without guilt. The version that believed time always brought people back. I folded my life into a small brown bag. I carried it like a suitcase of secrets. 4. The platform that swallowed boys the train station was louder than I expected. Not with joy. The rustling of uniforms that didn't quite fit yet, with shoes to clean, the eyes darting left and right like we were all looking for an escape no one would give us. Mothers stood too far back. Fathers lit cigarettes with shaky hands. Some people smiled, the kind of smile you wear when your heart is somewhere behind your ribs. It's begging you not to show it. I watched a boy who couldn't have been older than 16 tie a string around his finger. He said it was so he wouldn't forget who he was, but by the time the train arrived, his hands were fists, and the string had fallen off. The train without songs. Kay used to say trains meant travel, adventure, new beginnings. But this one sounded different. It didn't sing. It groaned, metal against metal, wheels grinding like teeth on the edge of an unwelcome truth. We sat in silence. Some closed their eyes, some clenched their jaws, some whispered prayers like broken lullabies. The man beside me, older, maybe 20, held a photograph so tightly that the edges cut his fingers. He didn't notice the blood. No one did. We were already leaving behind the part of us that knew how to feel pain properly. 5. My first night in uniform. It wasn't the cold that kept me awake that night. It was the stiffness of the fabric, the way it refused to move with me, like it hadn't been sewn for a body. For a roll, I lay in a cot that creaked with every breath. The ceiling above me flickered with light from a single swinging bulb. And all around me, men trying to sleep beside their fears. I missed my bed at home, the lumpy mattress, the chipped nightstand, the creaky floor outside my door that told me when someone passed. Here, even the silence felt monitored. Like if you exhaled too loudly, someone might ask for your name again, and this time might not remember it. 7. The first time I was counted down the second morning. We were lined up, boots on gravel, backs straight, eyes forward. The officer walked down the line, counting 1, 2, 3. I was 17, it's the number, and when he passed me, I tried to breathe in deep, tried to remember the smell of home, but it was gone. In its place, metal, dirt, sweat, uncertainty. That's the thing no one teaches. You don't stop being yourself all at once. You disappear in pieces, one count at a time. 8. The night before deployment, we didn't know where we were going, only that it was there wherever they were supposed to be. That night, they let us write one letter to anyone, one page only. I stared at the blank sheet for an hour. Then I wrote, "Dear Mother, I am still me." For now, I still remember how the stairs creak at home. I still remember the warmth of your bread. If I forget, write it back to me. I never knew if it was sent. I never knew if she read it. But I hope, somewhere in the quiet, my words touched her hands. Ix, marching toward somewhere they didn't say goodbye. They gave us orders. We moved at dawn. Fog sat low over the hills, like the sky was trying to hide us from what was coming. Boots crunched. Not in unison, not yet. The man in front of me whispered a joke to himself. I think it was about socks, or maybe about his wife. He laughed under his breath, and I realized he wasn't laughing for anyone. He was laughing with someone who wasn't there. What I carried with me by the time we reached the border of what would later be called the front. I collected things in my pockets that weren't on any list. A stone from the field. Behind my house, a folded scrap of newspaper with a crossword half done, a feather I found by the barracks. A string, like the one that boy had tied around his finger. None of it was useful. None of it tactical, but all of it reminded me that I was once a boy who listened to the wind. And even as I became a soldier, some part of me refused to let go of the boy who still wanted to grow old gently. The weight of the first button. They handed me my uniform in a room with no mirrors. I think that's important to mention, 'cause when I put it on for the first time, I had no idea how I looked, only how I felt. And what I felt was smaller, not because of the size of the uniform, but because of its weight. Not physical weight, not fabric or stitching, but the weight of being named something I wasn't yet. The weight of becoming someone else. The fitting that didn't fit the man who gave me the uniform didn't look at me. He tossed it onto a wooden table and said, "Make sure the buttons stay fastened." That's what matters. I nodded, but when I held the coat in my hands, it felt like holding a story I hadn't read yet. It smelled like old wool and wet stone, like halls I'd never walked, like promises I hadn't made. When I put it on, it pinched under my arms. The collar scratched my neck, just like my grandfather's coat once did. But this one wasn't passed down in love. It was passed forward in duty, and when I buttoned it, slowly, carefully, the world outside the window stopped sounding like mine. Too, the first button of all the buttons. Top one was the hardest. It was small, stubborn, took effort. Felt like a final decision, because once that top button was fastened, my throat didn't belong to me anymore. That's the truth. No one tells you. Uniforms don't just cover your body. They wrap around your voice. You don't speak the same way once you know someone else can command your silence. I remember fastening it, feeling my pulse against the wool and whispering to myself, "This isn't you, but maybe it has to be. For now." 3. Looking at the others, we stood in formation, a row of young men pretending to be still, but we weren't. I could see it in the eyes to my left. He blinked too often. To my right, a boy chewed the inside of his cheek like he was trying to keep his childhood from escaping through his teeth. Some had faces too old for their bodies. Others had bodies too big for their courage. But all of us wore the same thing. That's the point of a uniform, isn't it? To make fear look like order, to turn names into ranks. I wondered how many of them felt like I did, like we had been erased and redrawn with sharper lines. For the letter in my pocket in my third night in uniform. I placed a folded letter in the breast pocket, not to send, just to carry. It was blank, not a single word written. But it reminded me that I still had a voice, even if I wasn't using it. Carrying that blank letter was my way of saying, there's still something inside me that doesn't belong to them. I touched it each morning, right before stepping out into roll call, right before shouting, "Yes, sir," right before losing another inch of myself to discipline. It was my silence, tucked safely inside their uniform. Learning to aim. We were taught to aim before we were taught to understand what we were aiming at. They gave us rifles with no stories, just numbers, just mechanics, and then they taught us how to hold them like we were born knowing how to hold fear in our hands. I remember the first time I pulled the trigger. The sound startled me. The recoil made my shoulder ache. But it was the silence after that stayed with me longer. No one clapped. No one smiled. Just the sharp smell of metal and dust, and a voice saying, "Again." So I did, and again, until the sound didn't surprise me anymore. Okay. And that scared me more than anything, Vi. When days lost their names in training, days don't have names. There's no Monday, no Friday, okay? Number Sunday to miss your mother's stew. There's just wake, march, eat, clean, repeat. Sleep becomes optional. Dreams become risky. You learn to count time by the number of boots in line and the rhythm of whistles. In the morning, one day, I woke up and couldn't remember what month it was, or whether the leaves outside were green or gold. That's when I realized I was no longer living time. I was surviving it. Rain and orders. One morning, it rained hard. The kind of rain that soaks through wool and clings to your skin like regret. They made us stand in formation anyway. Boots sinking in mud, fingers stiff, eyes forward. Someone coughed. Another shivered. The officer walked past us and said, "This is what it feels like to last." But I didn't want to last. Not like that. Not as a statue in someone else's war. I wanted to go home and stand in the rain on purpose, with my shoes off, with my brother laughing beside me. With no orders, just water, and the freedom to say, "I'm cold," without punishment. 8. The notebook beneath my bed. At night, I wrote. Not always with words. Sometimes just with shapes, lines, dots, marks that meant nothing to anyone else but to me. They were proof that I hadn't been erased completely, that my mind still wandered, still remembered the color of my mother's apron, still recalled the sound of a match being struck in the dark. I hid the notebook beneath my cot, wrapped in a rag, protected like a secret. Every page I filled was another thread I held to the version of me I wasn't ready to lose. The feather I kept one afternoon. During weapons inspection, I found a feather by the edge of the barracks, small, white, torn at one side, like it had fought something and lost. I picked it up and kept it in my pocket. I didn't know why, but every time I touched it, I remembered the field behind my house, the way the wind moved, the way silence felt warm, not hollow. That feather didn't belong in war, but neither did I, not fully, and so I kept it, not as a sign of weakness, but as a quiet act of defiance. The moment I froze theirs, always a moment when everything freezes, not from fear, but from the realization that there's no going back for me. It was the day I saw my reflection in a puddle. I was dressed in full gear, face hardened, posture rigid. The eyes looked like they didn't belong to the face anymore, like they were watching someone else live inside. The trench that spoke to me. People always ask about the noise. They want to know what the war sounded like. The shouting, the blasts, the screaming, the cracks of rifles echoing off stone, the rumble of tanks like metal beasts in the distance. But what I remember most was the silence in between, the pauses, the waiting, the stillness of a trench at 4 a.m. when even the rats held their breath. And it was in that silence that the earth began to speak, not with words, but with memory. The first trench, the first time I climbed into a trench. I expected it to feel like a cage. It didn't. It felt like a whisper. The dirt was cold and damp. It clung to my uniform. The walls curved around me, uneven and raw, as if the land had been torn open and hadn't healed. There were sandbags piled like broken teeth, water pooled in corners, and boot prints in the mud that no longer matched anyone alive. But it wasn't the trench that scared me. It was the feeling that it had been waiting for someone to remember it, waiting to be heard. 2. The man who didn't speak. We were 5 in that trench. At least, most nights we were. There was Pierre, the boy from Marseille, who always kept a pebble in his pocket for luck. There was Anders, a quiet man from the north who drew birds in the margins of his notebook. There was Isaac, who prayed each morning with his eyes closed and palms to the ground. There was Malik, told stories so vivid that we almost forgot where we were. And then there was me. But there was one more, a sixth man, older, who barely spoke. He slept, curled in the far corner, his face hidden beneath the collar of his coat. One night, during a break in the shelling, he whispered to me, "The ground remembers more than the sky." I didn't understand. Not then, but I never forgot it. 3. The roots beneath my boots. Sometimes I'd wake early, before the others, for the light, and I'd crouch low, listening to the earth. I know it sounds mad, but there were mornings when I swore I could feel the heartbeat of the soil. Not literally, not like a drumbeat, but something pulsing, deep, slow, old, as if the roots beneath us were whispering stories of soldiers who had stood here before, centuries ago, as if the land kept a journal written in decay and rebirth, for the life that kept living even in war. Life refused to stop. We'd see ants rebuilding their hills between shell holes. We'd see mushrooms forcing their way through the frost. Once, I found a beetle carrying the broken wing of a moth as if trying to return it. And every time the world above us screamed, the world below us kept humming. The trench, despite its rot and rust and ruin, was still part of the earth, still breathing. And some days I found comfort in knowing that long after the gun stopped, this trench would become part of the forest again. That maybe one day a tree would grow where I once stood. No one would know what had been buried. THEREV, the fire that never caught it, was forbidden to make fire. Too dangerous, too visible. But one night, after days of rain, after hours of silence, Pierre lit a match. Just one. We all huddled close, watching that flame like it was the sun. It flickered, struggled, survived for 6, maybe 7 seconds, long enough to remind us what warmth felt like, long enough for someone, I don't remember who, to whisper a lullaby their grandmother used to sing. The match burned out, but the song stayed, and for the first time in weeks, we slept like boys again. VE. The song without word. Sanders couldn't speak our language well, but he could hum. He had this tune, soft, slow, strange, that none of us knew. He'd hum it while cleaning his rifle, writing in his notebook, while watching the sky like it owed him something. One day, I asked him what the song was. He shrugged and said, "It's from my home. Don't remember the name, but it used to play when it snowed." And after that, every time it snowed in the trench, and yes, it did snow, soft flakes falling like whispers, he'd hum that song. No words, it's just memory wrapped in melody. 7. The letter that didn't come. We were allowed letters, sometimes, but mail didn't always find us. One afternoon, a boy 3 trenches over received a letter wrapped in a different handwriting. He ran like he had found gold. The rest of us watched. Smiling, later that night, I checked the makeshift post bag. Nothing. Just an envelope from weeks ago, misdelivered, and soggy. Not mine, but I kept it anyway. Held it like it might still whisper something if listened hard enough. Sometimes, it's not the words we miss, but the possibility of them. 8. The feather returned. Do you remember the feather I told you I found? I lost it one night in a downpour. The trench flooded ankle deep. Mud swallowed everything. I thought it was gone. 2 mornings later, Anders handed me something, cupped in both hands like a bird. The feather, still there, dirtied, frayed, but still whole. He didn't say a word, just nodded, and in that moment, I realized we were all trying to hold on to something that the war hadn't touched, even if it was just a feather. Ike's, the visitor. We had a visitor once, a fox, Redford thin. It came at night, sniffing around the edge of the trench. None of us moved. We watched, breath held, as it padded through our shadows like it belonged. It didn't fear us, didn't flinch at the distant rumbles, didn't stay long, but when it left, tail low, eyes sharp, something settled in our chests. Pierre said. If it survives. Maybe we will too. No one answered, but I think we all believed it. X. When the ground breath there was one morning, a rare one, when everything was still. No wind, no birds, no orders. We just sat there, heads barely above the trench wall, watching the fog roll in. And I swear to you, I swear, the ground breathed. The mist curled through the trench like smoke from a tired pipe. The mud exhaled, the earth sighed, and I knew, deep in my bones, that the land was tired too, not just from this war. From all of them, from being asked again and again to hold the fallen. She, the name I whispered one night. We lost someone, quick. No ceremony, no trumpet, just silence. Afterward, while the others slept, I carved his name into the trench wall with the tip of my knife. Small, barely visible, but it was there. And I whispered it 3 times, not out of ritual, but because I was afraid that if I didn't, he'd vanish completely. The next morning, I saw a bird land on the edge of the trench, same spot. It didn't sing. It just sat there, facing the sunrise, and I knew the ground had remembered the letter I never sent. They told us to write home, that it would help, that it would give us something to hold on to, that it would keep us human. But what they didn't tell us was that there'd come a time when you couldn't remember how to begin, how to sound normal, how to talk about a world that no longer existed around you. And so, one night, I sat under the faint glow of a flickering lamp, and I wrote a letter I never planned to send. The first line, I stared at the page for so long it began to blur. The paper was wrinkled from the damp, my fingers stained with soot, my hands trembling slightly from cold or memory. I couldn't tell. I must have written 5 beginnings. Dear Mother, to my brother, if this ever reaches you. Today I heard a bird. It's hard to know where to start. None of them stuck, because how do you begin a letter when the person you're writing to can't possibly understand where you are now? And worse, when you're not sure you remember where they are either. The things I couldn't say I wanted to write. Today, I saw a man lose his voice after the blast. We sleep with one eye open, not because of fear, but habit. There's a boy here who cries in perfect silence every night. Someone carved a poem into a rock near the trench. It ends with the word again, but I couldn't, because those words don't travel well. They crumble in envelopes. They grow heavier with distance. So instead, I wrote about the weather, how my boots still don't fit. It's a memory of our kitchen window, a dream I had about the old oak tree in the backyard safe. Things, soft things, but not the truth, not the silence, not the ache, not the way war fills your mouth with dust every time you try to speak plainly. 3. The feather on the page. Placed the feather beside the paper, still carrying it, frayed now, bent slightly from the rain. It reminded me of how words used to come easily, how I once wrote stories just to make my brother laugh, and how now, even a letter felt like lifting a stone too heavy to move. The feather didn't say anything, but it felt like company, like it understood what I was trying and failing to do. For the empty paragraph halfway through the page left a blank space, no words, just silence on paper. I wanted it to mean something to say. Here is where the things I can't say would go. Here is the space between truth and protection. Here is where my voice breaks, and I pretend it doesn't. Sometimes silence speaks better than ink, and I hoped that if anyone ever read it, they'd pause there. They'd feel the weight of that emptiness, and they'd know it was full of everything I couldn't carry. The candlelight promised. The candle was low, barely a wick. Its light trembled like it too wasn't sure it should still be alive. And in that soft flicker, I made myself a quiet promise. If I get out of this, I will speak again. I will use my voice. I will not carry silence like armor anymore. It was not a vow of courage or revenge or heroism. It was a vow of softness, because war teaches you to clench your heart so tightly that even love forgets how to enter. But I didn't want to stay clenched, not forever. The letter I folded anyway. Eventually, I wrote, "Dear Mother, I don't know what to tell you today. The days blend together. The food tastes the same. The sky is still gray. But I'm still here. I still think of home when I hear the wind. That's all. Simple, untrue in many ways, but honest in others." I folded the paper, pressed it flat, slid it into an envelope I had been saving since the beginning, and then I placed it beneath my sleeping bag, where it would stay, where it still is, perhaps buried in the mud of a trench long forgotten. The 7th, what I wrote in the dirt the next day. After roll call, I went to the edge of the trench and picked up a stick. I scratched something into the earth. Not my name, not a prayer, just one word. Still, because I was. Despite everything, despite the way my voice had changed, despite the dreams I no longer trusted, despite the weight in my chest and the numbness in my toes, I was still here, still breathing, still me, somewhere under the dust. And if the wind carried that word into the trees, into the hills, into the hands of someone far away, maybe they'd know I hadn't given up. Not entirely. 8. The dream I couldn't escape that night. I dreamt of the letter again, but this time it had been opened, and my mother was reading it aloud to an empty room. She sat in her chair, one lamp lit, her glasses low on her nose. She read slowly, each word a thread, but the room stayed silent, as if the letter were too quiet for the world to hear. When she finished, she folded the paper neatly, kissed it, and placed it beside a loaf of bread on the kitchen table. I woke up crying, quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't come from pain, but from recognition. The clock in the corner, we had no clocks, but Anders had drawn one on the wall of the trench, scratched with a knife. 12 marks, 2 hands. Every morning, he changed the position. Not accurately, just imaginatively. It gave us the illusion of routine. One day, I asked him why he bothered. He said, "Because if I forget how to count the hours, I might forget I deserve to. Time in war is strange. It stretches and folds, but that scratched clock, it reminded me there was still a world with time in it. Time for letters, time for healing, time for silence to become peace." The letter I still carry. Never sent that letter, but I've carried it in my mind ever since. It's changed, of course, grown longer, more complicated, more raw. Sometimes I rewrite it in my head as I fall asleep, adding lines, removing details, pausing on memories I no longer trust. But one thing stays the same. I'm still here, and I still think of home when I hear the wind. The bread in the battlefield. You can survive without bread for a while, but you cannot survive long without the idea of it, the memory of it, the scent of it, the warmth of something rising, even in a world that feels like it's falling apart. That's what I learned the day we smelled bread in the middle of a battlefield. Hunger that wasn't just in the stomach. Hunger is a strange thing in war. It's not just about food. Sometimes it's about sound. Sometimes about touch. Sometimes about kindness. We were fed, technically, rations, hard biscuits, soup that tasted like cardboard, boiled in silence. Sometimes a slice of gray meat you didn't want to ask questions about, but none of it satisfied the kind of hunger we carried. We were starving for comfort, for something that didn't come in a tin, for something that smelled like before. And then, one morning, the wind shifted, and we smelled bread. 2. The smell that stopped the linnet drifted down into the trench like a ghost. Soft, warm, unmistakable. It was barely there, but once one of us smelled it, We all did. We looked at each other, confused, eyes wide, noses lifted like animals catching a scent in the wild. Anders dropped his shovel. Pierre stood completely still, as if frozen by memory. Is that? It can't be. You smell it too. No one knew where it came from. There were no villages nearby, no bakeries, no kitchens, just the torn up earth and the ghosts beneath it. But the smell was real. For a moment, so were we. 3. The memory it carried, that scent, that thin thread of yeast and warmth and crust. It pulled something out of each of us. I remembered my mother's apron, the way she wiped her hands on it, even when they were clean. I remembered Sunday mornings, waiting at the table with my brother, arguing over who got the end piece. I remembered my father humming, deep, broken tune that only appeared when something was in the oven and in the trench. For a single second, I forgot where I was. We all did. We weren't soldiers. We were sons again, for the loaf that shouldn't exist later that day. Malik returned from patrol. He was carrying something in his arms, wrapped in cloth, in disbelief. A loaf, dark, round, slightly burnt at the edges, but undeniably bread, real bread. We stared at it like it was made of gold, or light, or home. He sat down, carefully unwrapped it, and said, "There's an old man, half blind, living in a half-destroyed house just past the edge of the field. Still has a working oven. Said he bakes every third day. Desna." Why? Just does. No one moved, and then someone, I don't remember who, began to cry. The fire that made it. We asked Malik how the old man found firewood. He said he burns broken chairs, fence posts, a piano once, he said. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he did it. It's that, in a place where nothing grew, where smoke meant danger, where silence ruled every hour, someone had chosen to make bread, not to sell, not to store, but to give, because maybe he thought someone would need it. And we did. The way we ate it, we didn't rush. We didn't tear it apart like animals. We sat in a circle, quiet, reverent, and we passed it. Each piece broken by hand, shared with care. I watched Pierre close his eyes as he chewed, his lips trembling slightly. Anders whispered something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a name. Isaac kissed the piece before eating it. Malik just stared at the crust in his palm, as if it held every story he hadn't told. I held mine for a long time. It was still warm and in my chest. Something cracked open, not pain, not sorrow, but the faint, impossible feeling that we might live. 7. The note inside when we finished. Malik handed me the cloth the bread had been wrapped in. There was something stitched in the corner, rough thread, faded letters, a message. As long as I can make bread, the world hasn't ended. EJ. That was all. No address, no country. Just a quiet declaration from someone who still believed in something. And in that moment, so did we. 8. The birds that came after that night. Something strange happened. Just before dusk. A flock of birds landed near the trench. Dozens of them. They sat on the wire, on the broken branches, on the edge of the trench wall, and they sang. Not loud, not frenzied, just a quiet, natural melody that melted into the evening air. We didn't speak, we just listened. The bread had softened something in the world, and the world had responded with song. The night we slept differently that night. We slept differently. It wasn't warmer, it wasn't safer, but it felt softer, like something had shifted, like the trench had loosened its grip, like the silence wasn't so hollow anymore. No nightmares, no shouts, no fists clenched in fear, just the slow breath of men remembering they were still human, and the memory of something baked in fire and given in faith. The thread we held onto. We never found the old man again. The house was empty when Malik returned. Abandoned. A note on the door, burnt at the edges. No bread. No smoke. Just silence. But we never forgot him, or his bread, or that scent. It became a thread. Something we held on to when the world frayed. And even now, all these years later, sometimes when I pass a bakery, when I smell yeast rising and crust forming, I close my eyes and I am there again, in the mud, in the cold, surrounded by men trying not to vanish, and a single loaf that said, "We were still here." The captain's watch. Time does not flow the same way in war. It warps, folds, it gets lost in silence, then comes crashing back in a single sound that steals a year from your soul. You can wake up thinking it's Wednesday, only to discover it's been Sunday for 3 weeks, because no one celebrates Sundays anymore. It's not here. But there was a man, a captain with a limp and a voice like gravel, who carried time in his chest pocket, or at least what was left of it. And that was the first time I understood. Time doesn't have to tick to be remembered. The watch that didn't move. He arrived one morning. It's just after dawn. We were expecting replacements. You learn quickly to stop hoping for reinforcements. But he didn't walk like someone arriving. He walked like someone returning. He wore no expression. His coat was stained with rain and soot. His boots spoke of long roads. And pinned to his lapel was a cracked gold watch on a thin, bent chain. It didn't tick, but he touched it often, like he would a photograph of someone you no longer speak of, but can't quite forget. 2. The captain, with no name. He didn't offer his name. He simply said, "Captain, that's all you need." And we accepted that, not out of fear, out of something strange of respect. He didn't bark orders, didn't demand things. He simply stood where he was needed, spoke when silence began to hurt, and watched the sky like it owed him something. And that watch on his coat, it remained there, always, even while he slept. I once asked Malik, "Why do you think he wears it if it doesn't work?" He answered without looking up, "Maybe it still tells him something we can't hear." 3. What the watch used to be one cold night. So cold, we passed around a stone just to feel heat. The captain sat beside the fireless lantern and whispered, "It stopped at 2:17, 2 years ago. That's when everything changed. I've kept it there ever since." He didn't say what happened at 2:17. He didn't need to, because we all had a time like that. A minute frozen. A breath never exhaled. A memory that refuses to move on even when everything else does. His was 2:17. Mine was a letter I never finished writing. 4. When the watch was passed around, there came a night when morale was thinner than the soup. We hadn't heard from command in 8 days. Sky was gray even at midnight. Someone joked we had been forgotten entirely. That was the night the captain did something we never expected. He took off the watch, held it in his palm, and said, "Pass it around, hold it. Don't ask questions, just feel it." So we did. One by one, we passed it along. It's all, and every man who held it went quiet, not sad, not scared, just still, as if the watch carried not time, but memory. And for a moment, we each remembered a part of ourselves we'd stopped visiting. What I saw when I held it, when it reached me. I didn't expect anything, but the moment it touched my hand, I smelled oranges, warm, sunlit oranges, like the ones my mother peeled for us in summer after hanging laundry. I saw my brother chasing a dog across the field. I heard my father's boots on the stairs. I felt a breeze that didn't smell like gunpowder, and for just one heartbeat, I wasn't here, not in the trench, not in the war. I was home. I didn't even realize I had tears on my face until the captain gently took the watch back. The captain's quiet, Ruli told us later, when we sat around pretending the world wasn't ending. Time isn't something you check, it's something you carry. And if you carry too much of, the wrong kind. You forget how to be where your feet are. He never explained what he meant. He didn't need to, because by then, he understood that time wasn't just passing. It was leaving things behind. And if we didn't hold on to those things, moments, memories, names, the silence would take them, and we'd become nothing but uniforms and shadows. 7. The day time froze again happened during a lull, a rare day of calm. No shelling, no orders, no sound but our own breathing. The captain was reading an old book with half the pages missing. Malik was sharpening a stick for no reason. Pierre was humming something off-key. Then the wind changed, just slightly. We all looked up because the birds had vanished, and the air had shifted. That's when we heard it, the distant thud of something heavy, not close, but not far enough. And without thinking, every man in the trench froze at the exact same time, the same second, the same held breath. And in that moment, we all understood the captain's watch. We were living our own 2:17:8, the memory of before that night. I found the captain sitting alone, no lamp, no book, just the watch in his hand, open. He was staring at it like it still ticked. It still mattered, like it still hurt. I sat beside him, but said nothing. After a while, he whispered, "It belonged to my brother." That was all. But it was everything, because suddenly the limp made sense. The silence, the softness, the reason he never barked, never broke, never blamed. He wasn't leading us because of rank. He was leading us because someone he loved once wore this same coat and didn't come back to IX. The night the watch was buried, we didn't lose the captain to battle. We lost him to a choice. One night, during an evacuation, a young soldier fell into a crater, badly injured. Calling out, none of us could reach him. But the captain went. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask for help. He just jumped down and carried the boy out on his back. He made it, but his leg gave way on the climb. And when we found him, he was lying near the edge, eyes open, hand on the watch. He was still breathing, just barely. He handed me the watch and said, "Only this. Bury it. Time doesn't belong to me anymore." X. The hill above the trench, we buried it at sunrise. No grave, no ceremony. Just a hole dug in the soft dirt at the top of the hill, overlooking our trench. We placed the watch inside a tin box, wrapped in a strip of his coat. We left a feather beside it, and a note that simply read, "For the time we still carry." As we walked back down, the sky lightened, birdsong returned, and for a brief moment, we felt like something sacred had been restored, not in time, but in meaning. The wind stopped first. War doesn't always begin with a sound. Sometimes it begins with the absence of one. No siren, no scream, no order shouted from a hill. Just a pause, stillness, a wind that stops moving, as if the sky itself is holding its breath. The day the wind stopped was the day I started listening to what silence was trying to tell me, and it never stopped speaking again. The morning, nothing moved. I woke up before the others, not because of a dream, not because of a shift in guard. It's just something in the air. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, no fluttering of the cloth we used to mark north. The smoke from the small fire Malik had built the night before rose straight into the sky. Then, like a thread, uninterrupted, it looked unnatural, like the world was frozen, and we had walked into the middle of a photograph we didn't remember posing for. 2. The silence that showed you to yourself with no noise. You start to hear things you usually avoid, your breath, your heartbeat, the thoughts that aren't quite words, just aches that curl up behind your ribs. That morning, I sat on the edge of the trench wall and listened to myself, really listened, and I heard things I didn't want to admit. The fear I had named discipline, the grief I had hidden behind duty, the anger I had stuffed into jokes The love I had refused to send in letters and noise. You can pretend in silence. You meet yourself without armor, and I wasn't sure I liked the man I met. 3. The field that refused to sway there was a small patch of weeds growing on the ridge just beyond our position. Normally, they danced, even on the quiet days. They moved, bowing gently to winds we couldn't see. But that morning, they were still, completely still, and Pierre noticed first. He whispered, "They're listening." We didn't laugh, not because it wasn't funny, but because it felt true. Something was listening, and for once, it wasn't us. For when the birds disappeared, you can get used to the absence of people, but not the absence of birds. Even in war, they linger, they adjust, they build nests in helmets, they weave twigs between bayonets, they sing through smoke. But that day, they were gone. No song, no wing beats, no silhouettes across the gray. We scanned the sky like children looking for balloons long after the party ended. And then Anders said softly, "Something's coming." Even the birds don't want to see it. What we didn't say that day: when you live in a place where sound is often violent, you grow used to silence being sacred. But this silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't heavy. It was waiting, like the earth had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. We didn't speak. Not really. We whispered. We gestured. We nodded and moved like ghosts rehearsing a story. We already knew the ending of Dot, and no one asked the question that sat in all our throats. What happens when the wind doesn't return? The soldier with no boots midday. A scout returned to our trench. His uniform was stained, his face hollow, and he had no boots. He limped through the mud like a figure out of myth, barefoot, broken, blinking at the sky like it had betrayed him. He didn't speak, just sat near the edge, cupped his hands to his ears, and said, "Too quiet. It's too quiet." They're doing something with the quiet. We offered water. We asked what he saw, but he just closed his eyes and rocked, as if waiting for a lullaby he'd never hear again. 7. The hole in the ground. That breath. Later that afternoon, I walked beyond the trench. Not far, just to the edge of the bluff where wild grass had once grown. There, I found a hole, not man-made, not dug with purpose. It looked like the earth had opened its mouth and decided to speak. I kneeled beside it. No wind, no sound, but I swear I could feel air rising from it. Warm, measured. It was breathing, or maybe I was imagining it. After all, what is war if not the slow unraveling of what you trust about your own senses? 8. What returned first? Round dusk. A sound returned. Not the wind. Not a shout. Not even a gunshot. It was the sound of metal scraping against itself. Soft, sharp, rhythmic. Isaac was cleaning his rifle, and the cloth he used made a tiny, circling hiss against the barrel. That's all, but it was enough to break the spell. We all looked at him like he'd just spoken the name of a god we'd forgotten. He paused, met our eyes, and said, "If they're going to come, I'd rather meet them clean." 9. The shell that never fell. That night, we heard a whistle. A high, falling note, shrill and certain. The kind of sound that precedes an explosion. The kind that turns lungs to lead. We braced, counted seconds, waited, but it never landed. No blast, no tremor, no smoke. Just silence again. The kind that gets inside your teeth. And we all looked at each other, each of us wondering the same thing. Did the wind carry it away? Or did the world forget how to finish the story? The lantern that flickered. Malik lit the lantern early that night. He usually waited until full dark, but the silence made him nervous. The flame danced as if trying to speak little bursts, sharp flicks, quiet pops, and we all sat around it, not for heat, but for company. And then Pierre said, What if the silence means they're listening? Now, no one laughed. Not this time, because in that moment, we all believed that perhaps war was not just fought with weapons, but with sound. And silence was the sharpest one of all. When we laughed through the fear, fear doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it drips in slowly, a chill behind your ear, okay? A breath you forget to take, a quiet what if that echoes too loudly in your own head. In war, fear becomes background noise, expected, worn like an extra layer of clothing. But laughter, that's different. Laughter shows up like a wrong note in a funeral hymn, clumsy, out of place, and sacred. Somehow, the night we laughed through the fear was the night I remembered what it meant to be alive, and that scared me more than anything. The joke about the wallet started with a wall. Cracked, crumbled, half-shelled from last week's barrage. Malik pointed at it and said, if that wall had any more holes, it'd qualify for officer training. So silence. Then a breath, a sharp exhale from Pierre. Not quite a laugh, but enough. Malik shrugged, picked up a chunk of the wall, and added, should I take this to headquarters? Might be the most stable piece of leadership we've got. This time, we laughed low, uneasy, like children who know they shouldn't, but can't help it. And once it started, we couldn't stop. 2. The kind of laughter that hurts it wasn't joyful. It wasn't careless. It was the kind of laughter that lives beneath the ribs, waiting for a crack to escape through. I doubled over. So did Anders. Pierre wiped tears from his eyes, muttering, stop, stop, stop. Between each gasp, even Isaac, so solemn, so faithful, let out a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh or a sob or both. The captain's absence was felt, his empty seat beside the fire suddenly less heavy. We didn't need permission to laugh, just air and silence willing to let us fill it. 3. The game with the bullet. Later that night, Pierre pulled a single bullet from his pocket, held it between his fingers. He said, this little thing thinks it's important. Let's show it. It's not, hey? And then he flipped it like a coin, called heads. I get to go home first. Tails, you all owe me your rations. It hit the ground, planted on its side, didn't roll, didn't settle. Just stayed there, leaning, and that, somehow, was the funniest thing we'd ever seen. We howled. Even the rats seemed startled. It was absurd. It was dangerous. It was perfect. We gave the bullet a name, treated it like royalty, put it in a tin, and called it Commander Round. 4. The Feast of Nothing. 2 days later, our rations ran out. It was expected, but still bitter, so Anders declared we'd host a banquet. He laid out the empty cans, lined them up like a buffet, found a stick, and used it as a ladle. Welcome, gentlemen, he said in a posh accent. Tonight's menu includes air-fried crumbs, dehydrated disappointment, and a souffle of absolutely nothing. We applauded, laughed until our ribs ached, and for a brief moment, we forgot we were starving, because in our minds, we'd just eaten like kings. Fee. When the other trench heard us, the laughter must have carried. 'Cause across the ravine, the other trench called back. A voice, unfamiliar, uncertain, shouted, what's so funny over there, Kay? And Malik, without missing a beat, answered, your haircut? Probably. Silence. Then a chuckle. Tid. Then another. Then a howl from across the void. Men we'd never seen, facing the same horrors, were laughing with us from the other side of a ditch carved by death. For 5 minutes, the war paused, not by treaty, not by order, but by laughter, a ceasefire of the soul. Vi. What we remembered that night, around the lantern, we took turns telling stories from home, not about pain, not about goodbye, but about ridiculous things. Pierre told us about the time he glued his shoe to a chicken. Anders shared how he accidentally proposed to the wrong girl in a dark theater. I confessed that I once cried because a goose chased me into a river. Malik claimed he once set his school's desk on fire trying to make tea. We laughed so much it hurt, because the stories weren't about war. They were about before, and they reminded us that we were still made of more than fear. 7. The sock war somehow. Someone had 5 different socks, none matching. Malik suggested we hold a vote on which was the most heroic. Pierre fashioned his into a tiny flag. Isaac folded one into a dove shape. Anders used his as a hand puppet named General Toes. We held a ceremony, announced a winner, sang an anthem badly, and cheered. It was ridiculous. It was childish. It was medicine. No one won the war that night, but for the first time in weeks, we felt like we were winning something, even if it was just the right to laugh. 8. When we laughed quietly, there was another kind of laughter. 2. Softer, private, the kind you don't share. Late one night, I woke to find Anders covering his face with his blanket, shaking slightly. At first, I thought he was crying. I reached out. He turned, eyes red from tears and laughter both. I remembered. My sister used to wear my helmet and pretend to be a soldier. She used to shout orders to the cat. He laughed again, then cried, then laughed, and I lay beside him, listening to the mix of sounds as if they were the most sacred music ever made. The morning after, the next morning. The sky was impossibly blue, too bright for where we were, too gentle for what we'd endured. The wind returned, soft, not cold, and the birds sang again. But more importantly, we were smiling, not forced, not to survive, just smiling. Fear was still there. The war hadn't ended. Nothing had truly changed, except us, because we had laughed together through the fear, and something inside us had come back to life. What laughter left behind, they say. Laughter echoes, that it lingers. I believe that, even now, decades later, when I sit alone and the world is too quiet, I can still hear it. Malik's bad impersonations, Anders' dry wit, Pierre's wheezing cackles, my own short bursts of disbelief. It doesn't make the war beautiful, but it reminds me that even in the darkest places, some part of us refused to die. We laughed through the fear, and in doing so, we remembered who we were before we were told to forget. The bench behind the barracks. There was a bench behind the barracks. No one built it. Not recently, anyway. It had always just been there, crooked, weather-beaten, missing one slat in the seat, so if you sat too fast, you'd feel it in your back. But that bench, that forgotten, splintered bench, it's the one place in the entire war where I felt like myself again, and no one ever asked why. I sat there so often, maybe because they knew, maybe because they had their own places like that, or just too afraid to return to them. The way the light fell there, it was on the far side of the encampment, near the edge of a thinning forest. You had to step over wire, past the old fence post that no longer held anything, and duck beneath the branch that leaned like a tired shoulder. But once you made it there, you'd notice how the light fell. It's differently, soft, filtered, like sunlight had found its manners and decided not to shout. I went there at dawn when I couldn't sleep, at dusk when I was afraid to. The light didn't care if I was a soldier. It only asked that I be still. 2. What I did there, I didn't write. Not often. Not like I did at first. Instead, I remembered. Not always on purpose. Memories just showed up, uninvited, stubborn, loyal, like the dog that followed me home every day as a boy, like the name of the girl I never kissed, like the smell of oranges in spring. And sometimes I whispered to myself, as if reading from a book that had been written inside me. Here is where you fell off your bicycle. Here is where your father laughed with his whole chest. Here is where your mother stood by the window, waiting. None of it had anything to do with war, but all of it had to do with why I wanted to survive it. 3. The day Malik sat beside Mamalik wasn't the type to sit still. He told stories with his hands, paced when thinking, sang out of tune just to break tension. But one evening, before the fog rolled in, he found me on the bench. Didn't say a word, just sat. He held a piece of wood, a broken crate panel, began carving something into it with a dull knife. I watched. He didn't look up. Eventually, I asked, "What are you carving?" He answered, "Nothing. I just want to leave a mark on something that isn't my own heart for once." We didn't speak again for a while, and that silence was one of the most complete conversations I've ever had, for the wind that chose that spot even when the air was still everywhere else. The bench got wind, gentle, sporadic, just enough to move the edge of your collar or stir the grass at your feet. I came to believe that the wind knew that bench better than we did, that it came there to rest. 2 and on days when I felt like a wall, cracked hard, unmoving the wind was the only thing that reminded me I still had edges that could feel. The smallest things became clear on the bench. You started noticing things no one else did. A beetle dragging a pebble up a root. Moss grows first where sunlight lands last. The stitching at the edge of your coat that had begun to unravel. The sound of your own breathing. And in those small things, clarity arrived, not like a revelation, but like a slow unfolding. You didn't learn anything new. You just remembered what you'd forgotten was true. The scarf that was left. There one morning, there was a scarf on the bench. Wool, dusty blue, frayed at the end, like it had been worried between fingers too many times. No, one claimed it. It stayed there for 3 days, and we all respected it, like it belonged to a ghost who still came to sit. Then, one afternoon, just before rain, Anders picked it up, wrapped it once around his neck. No words, no question. We all nodded. And that was that. It wasn't about ownership. It was about honoring absence and the bench. The bench had understood that better than we ever could. 7. The memory that returned uninvited had Ann. T thought of my grandfather in years, but one dusk, sitting on the bench with my boots off and socks damped from dew, I remembered the sound of his voice reading to me, not the words. The sound, the rhythm of it. The pauses, the way he coughed at commas and smoothed the pages between chapters. And just like that, I was crying. Not loudly, not broken, just softly, like rain slipping off a windowsill. Because in a world that had demanded I become a machine, the memory of being held by a voice felt unbearable and utterly necessary. 8. The day the bench broke it was Pierre. Of course it was. He flopped onto the bench too hard, laughing about something ridiculous. And the leg gave out. We scrambled to catch it. It fell crooked, but not completely, and Pierre, sitting on the tilted edge, whispered it was bound to give in eventually. Even strong things collapse when too many people rely on them. He laughed again, but I didn't, because I knew he wasn't talking about the bench. 9. What we did with the broken slat, we didn't fix it. Not really. We just turned the broken slat into something else. Malik carved it into a small box, lined it with pages from his prayer book. Anders added a stone to weigh it down. I wrote one line on the inside of the lid. This bench remembered us. We buried it under the tree closest to the spot, said nothing aloud. No speech, no goodbye, just placed our hands on the earth and let it hold the memory. X. When I returned, there alone, there were days the others couldn't come. Too tired, too much guard duty, too much rain, too much grief. But I still went. I sat alone, and the bench, now crooked, slanted, soft by use, still held me, still whispered, still invited stillness in a world that demanded noise. And there, in that quiet, began to understand. It wasn't the bench I needed. It was what I allowed myself to feel When I sat there the day no one fired, there were no orders, no white flags, no messages passed under wire, no signals, no drums, no officers with trembling hands. It just happened. One morning, on a day like any other, gray, brittle, expectant, no one fired. And in that fragile space where death had once been scheduled, something else arrived instead. We didn't plan it. We didn't expect it. But the silence was so loud, it felt like it had been waiting longer than we had. The morning was wrong. You know, that feeling when you wake up and the world feels off. That's what it was like. The fog was thicker than usual, but not heavy. More like cotton than smoke. Soft, pale, suspended. I couldn't hear footsteps, or metal, or coughing. No boots in mud. No rifles being adjusted. Just breath. Even that. Slower than usual. I rubbed my eyes, stepped outside the trench, and saw a crow on the wire, still as a nail in a wall no one wanted to fix. 2. The rifles stayed cold usually by that hour. You could feel tension in the barrels. Not heat exactly, but the memory of heat. Steel holds anxiety, even when unused. Book. But that day, my rifle felt like a spoon left too long in cold tea. And so I set it down. Didn't say why, didn't need to. And when I looked around, the others were doing the same. One by one, without words, we let the metal rest. It was not surrender. It was something stranger: permission to not fire. To not prove anything. To just be. 3. The soldier across the field, I saw him around mid-morning. He stepped into the open, not running, not ducking, just standing, hands at his sides, a helmet, crooked eyes squinting against the fog. And in my gut, I braced. I thought, he'll fall. Someone will shoot. This is it. But no one moved. Not us. Not them. Not him. He stood there for a long time, then turned back, walked slowly into the mist, and I felt my knees give slightly, like a string had been loosened inside my chest. For what we did instead, Malik told a story. Not a loud one. It's just a short tale about a dog he once knew who refused to be leashed. Isaac prayed, eyes open this time. He didn't speak, just looked at the sky like it might remember us. Pierre carved something into the trench wall. Inked. Face. A soft one. Anders wrote a poem on the back of a ration label, folded it twice, tucked it into the dirt like a seed. And I watched the air move without fear of what it carried. The sky opened quietly around noon. The fog began to lift, not all at once. It didn't vanish. It rose like an old man standing after a long nap. We saw the trees again. The broken chapel steeple far off to the east, and the outline of the ridge that usually echoed with fire, but nothing came from it. No blast, no scream, no punishment. The silence held. In the sky, pale blue, scattered with clouds, stretched itself like a shirt too long in the drawer, and we breathed, fully, deeply, like we'd forgotten how. The return of color red wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The yellow in the grass, the red of a single berry, the green on a moss-covered rock, and a pink in someone's cheeks as the sun finally touched skin without guilt. We began pointing things out, like children. Look at that leaf. That tree wasn't bent like that yesterday. I think I hear bees. That cloud looks like a boat. But there was no shame in it. No sarcasm. Only wonder. Raw. Newborn. Unsure. Holy. 7. A letter was read aloud. Anders had received one 2 weeks earlier, but hadn't opened it. He said he was saving it for a day. When it didn't feel like we were ghosts. So he opened it. It was from his sister. Simple words, describing a new dress, a garden that wasn't growing, a neighbor who still played the same song on the same broken piano. He read slowly, voice trembling, key pausing often, not from emotion, but from reverence, and we sat around him, silent. as if listening to a sacred text from a world that still believed in tomorrow. 8. The things we cleaned think we'd rest, but no. We cleaned boots, canteens, hair, fingernails, wounds. Malik even trimmed his beard with a cracked mirror. Pierre relaced his boots, cursing the knots. Isaac wiped down his helmet until it shone, not because we were preparing, but because we remembered that we had bodies, and bodies, when not at war, deserved to be kept. Ix. The message from the birds late afternoon. They came back, not many, not loud, just the sparrows maybe, landing near the trench wall where Anders had buried his poem. They pecked, chirped, lifted off again, but before they flew away, one of them turned, or seemed to, and faced us. It didn't mean anything, and yet it meant everything, because sometimes the world sends no message, only presence, and presence after absence. It's the message. X. When the light changed. Wasn't sunset yet, but the light had changed. It turned golden, not the color of endings, but of pauses, of breath before a word, of the moment just before the kiss, of the second right before a child speaks their first sentence. We stood together, looking toward the ridge. Still nothing, and in that light, no uniforms mattered, no sides, no past, just men, tired, human, alive, and for the first time in too long, unafraid. The voices that return slowly. You forget, after a while, what your own voice sounds like, not your spoken voice that continues even in war. You bark orders, you whisper jokes, recite names of fallen friends at dusk, but the voice that lives deep inside, the one that asks questions, that narrates your fears, that remembers who you were before you were told who to become, that voice goes quiet, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for years, and then, one morning, it returns, not all at once, not in thunder, but like the first word of a sentence you didn't know you were brave enough to say. The whisper, I almost missed it, came while I was shaving. Not because I wanted to look good, just because I needed to feel like a person again. I was scraping the blade across my chin, watching my reflection in a dented piece of metal that barely held a face anymore. And suddenly, softly, a thought rose from somewhere deep. You still recognize yourself? I dropped the blade, not from fear, from surprise, because I hadn't heard me in so long. I didn't know how to answer. 2. What the mirror didn't hide, the makeshift mirror showed me more than it used to, lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago, eyes that searched the background, even in stillness, a mouth that only smiled with permission. But more than that, the mirror revealed what wasn't there anymore, the softness, the curiosity, the way I used to tilt my head as if the world were offering me riddles instead of threats. I stared at that ghost of myself, and I didn't flinch, because some ghosts aren't meant to scare us. They're meant to remind us what we left behind. 3. The notebook I hadn't opened, buried beneath my cot, wrapped in cloth and reluctance, was my notebook. I hadn't touched it in weeks, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I feared what might spill out once I started listening again. But that morning, something changed. I unwrapped it, sat on the bench by the cold wall, and flipped to a blank page. Then I wrote, "Are you still in there?" And I waited. IV, the silence that answered first. There was no reply. Course not, just silence, but not the kind that closes in, the kind that opens, a silence that makes. Spaced out, and in that quiet, I heard something else. My memories, soft, shy, returning one at a time, a bicycle tire spinning, the sound of flour being sifted, the way my sister whispered my name when she wanted something, and beneath it all, a voice that wasn't angry or loud, just honest. V. The song without lyrics Malik was humming again, a tune none of us knew, soft, wandering, I sat beside him and asked, "What is that?" He shrugged. "I don't remember. I think it's made of pieces of things I used to know." And I understood him more in that moment than I ever had before, because the voice inside us doesn't return with a speech. It returns with fragments, echoes, melodies we can't name, but still, we hum them, because some part of us remembers the tune, even when the words are gone. Vi, the log that became a confession booth behind the latrine hut. There was a fallen log, split down the middle, old, softened by rain. I went there when I needed to speak without being answered. I sat on one side, faced the trees, and let the words come out, not loud, structured, just spoken. I missed the smell of oranges. I don't remember my father's handwriting anymore. I saw a bird and forgot what kind it was. Oh, I used to believe I was brave, and the trees, they listened, without judgment, without reply. And sometimes that's all healing needs. 7. The question that hit me hard, Pierre, was fixing a strap on his satchel, nursing softly, muttering about the stitching. Then he looked up at me, smiled faintly, and asked, "What's the first thing you'll say to your mother if you make it home?" I froze, because I didn't know. I hadn't thought about it, not because I didn't care, but because hope like that felt dangerous. Still, sat with the question, and later, under my breath, I answered, "I'm sorry it took me this long to write back." 8. The letter I finally wrote that night. I lit a candle stub, found a dry scrap of paper, tore it into halves, just in case I messed it up, and I wrote a letter, not to a command, not to a comrade, to myself. You are not broken. You are tired, and that's different. You are not lost. You are just further from home than you've ever been. But home is not gone. It waits, and when you're ready, even if your feet don't return, your voice will. I folded the letter, pressed it between 2 pages of my notebook. Can breathe? Really? Breathed. Ix. When we started telling the truth, again we stopped pretending. Stopped answering "I'm fine" when we weren't. Stopped hiding tremors. Stopped laughing at pain to make it easier. We told the truth in pieces, in pauses, and half-finished sentences, and no one looked away. That's how you know your voice has returned, when it no longer needs to shout to be heard. Just whispering, just being becomes enough. X. What the voice taught MIT didn't say. You'll be okay. It's over now. You are strong. No. The voice said things I needed more than comfort. It said, you are hurt, and that matters. You don't have to earn rest. What you remember is real. You are still someone beneath the uniform. You don't have to forget to survive. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of silence, because it wasn't empty anymore. It was listening, and inside it. Okay. So was I, the first night without the uniform. I didn't take it off out of rebellion or protest or exhaustion. I took it off because I wanted to feel what it was like to touch my own skin again. It had been months, maybe longer, since I felt myself without layers of wool, rank, sweat, and expectation. That night, no one was watching. When the world had finally gone quiet, I unbuttoned the uniform and placed it beside me on the wooden bench behind the barracks. And for the first time in so long, I breathed like I used to when I wasn't being watched by death. The weight I didn't know I was wearing you. Do you think a uniform is just fabric, stitching, design, a tool? But it isn't. It's a container. It holds everything you've become. It's everything you're trying to be, and everything you've lost in the process. It holds commands you've obeyed, orders you've followed, names you've learned and buried, words you've swallowed. It holds shame and grief. It's pride you didn't ask for. When I folded it that night, it didn't collapse like cloth. It settled like a memory, finding its final shape too. The undershirt that didn't fit anymore beneath the coat was my undershirt, gray, stained, thin at the shoulders, I looked down and realized it didn't hang on me the way it used to. My body had changed. Thinner, more angles, thin curves, more edges than ease. I touched my collarbone, prominent, sharp, and thought, I used to hate how soft I looked. Now I miss it. And maybe that's the curse of surviving. Leave one pain behind, only to miss the one you once called weakness. 3. The socks that remembered. They were wool, frayed at the heels, smelled faintly of earth, metal, and damp mornings. But they were from home. My mother had packed them. She always said my feet ran cold. They had holes now, but I couldn't throw them away, because somehow they'd become the last untouched part of me. So that night, as I peeled them off and let my bare soles touch the dirt, I whispered, "You brought me farther than you should have. Thank you." Even socks deserve a blessing sometimes. 4. The cold didn't beat. I expected to shiver, to miss the thick coat, the stiff collar, but I did. Not at first. The cold touched me like an old friend, not with cruelty, but with honesty. And I realized something. I wasn't afraid of the cold. I was afraid of being unprotected, of being seen. But standing there beneath the stars, wrapped only in thin cotton and skin, I felt more human than I had in months. And the cold said, "There's still something inside you that feels." What I wrote on my chest high. Had a piece of charcoal in my pocket, left over from marking supplies. I took it out and, without really knowing why, pressed it to my own chest, just above my heart, and wrote one word: still alive, still here, still me, not a rank, not a role, not a ghost in waiting, just still. And I stood there, feeling the weight of it, without the armor I'd worn so long that I'd forgotten how heavy it had become. 5. The moment I looked down, we rarely looked at ourselves. There were no mirrors, no photographs, no time. But that night, I did. I looked down at my hands, at my arms, at my chest, marked with dust in that one soft word, at the legs that had carried me further than I ever asked them to. And I said to myself, as if reminding a lost child, "You're still a person. You're not just what happened to you. You don't owe the world more than your breath." And for a long while, I let that be enough. 7. The sound that stayed quiet. No one called for me. No whistles, no orders, no shouted names. The camp was still, wrapped in its own breath, as if giving me space. Or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore. The constant hum of command, the static of duty. Maybe what I was hearing was something I hadn't allowed myself to hear. My own quiet, not silence, just quiet. And in that quiet, I didn't feel guilty for standing still. 8. Where I placed the uniform, didn't hang it, didn't hide it. I laid it down, carefully, folded the sleeves like arms that once held things I couldn't, smoothed the collar. Then I placed a stone on top of it, flat, round, warm from the sun earlier that day. Not as a marker, not as weight, as a promise that I'd come back to it when I was ready. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. The skin I forgot was mine. You live long enough inside a roll, and you forget what you look like beneath it. That night, sitting half-dressed, in the dark, I ran my fingers over scars. New ones, old ones. The last silence inside me. The last silence wasn't outside me. It wasn't in the field, or the trench, or the mess hall at dawn. It was inside. A quiet that never spoke, but watched, waited, weighed everything. It sat in the corners of my mind like smoke from an old fire, lingering, even after the wood had turned cold. And I carried it, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know I had the right to put it down, until one night, it finally asked to be heard. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a pause, that strange, aching kind, the kind that comes not from silence, but from realizing you've been silent for far too long. I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, watching a spider trace a path along a beam, and the thought came as clear as daylight. If you don't let it speak now, it never will. I didn't know what it was. Not exactly, but I knew I'd been avoiding it. 2. The helmet I couldn't throw away there was a box under my cot. It held things I hadn't touched since I packed them. A photograph, some letters, an old handkerchief with a stitched name, and the helmet, scratched, dented, still stained with the sweat of days I don't name out loud. I picked it up, held it in both hands, and sat with it. It smelled of metal and time, and somehow, just holding it opened a door inside me that I had locked on purpose. 3. The thought that wouldn't go away wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even a memory. It was just a question, a quiet, persistent question that had been whispering for months, but had never been brave enough to speak. What did it cost you? Not what it cost others, not the war's toll in numbers or names, but me. What did it cost you to survive? I sat with that, like a stone in my lap, heavy, real, and I didn't answer it. Not yet, but I didn't turn away from it either, and that was new. 4. The memory that waited in the mirror I went to the basin, washed my face, looked into the glass fragment, nailed to the wall. But this time, I didn't look for dirt or stubble. I looked for him, the boy I used to be. He wasn't gone, just buried. I saw him in the corners of my mouth, in the softness of my shoulders, in the hope still hiding behind my exhaustion. And I whispered, just loud enough for my soul to hear, I'm sorry I left you behind. And for the first time, the mirror didn't flinch. The silence that spoke and questioned said, came in waves, not answers, questions soft, persistent. When did you first start to disappear? Why do you flinch when someone says your name too kindly? What do you miss that you won't admit to missing? A part of you is still waiting to be welcomed home. Who were you before you were called brave? They didn't accuse me, they invited me, and I realized then healing doesn't shout, it acts. The candle that didn't burn out lit one. It's a small one, no ceremony, no reason, just a flame, steady, unbothered, and I watched it for hours. It didn't flicker, didn't rush, it simply was, and as it burned, I thought, this is what I want to be. Not fire, not storm, just steady. And for the first time, I didn't feel foolish for wishing that. 7. What I finally said aloud, I went to the edge of camp, where the woods began, where no one usually goes unless ordered. And I said it, out loud, not shouted, not whispered. I don't want to carry this anymore. I said it again. I don't know what it means to be whole, but I want to learn, again. I want to be someone who can sit in the quiet without fear. Then I stood there and let the words sink into the soil. 8. The burial that wasn't a grave. I took the old scarf, the one from the first winter, threadbare, smelling of time and tears. I wrapped a stone in it, tied it with a string, and buried it behind the mess tent. Not because it was cursed or sacred, but because I needed a ritual, something to say, this doesn't belong to me anymore. And when I stood up, my hands covered in earth, I felt lighter, not healed, but less burdened. Sometimes that's enough. The quiet that didn't hurt that night. When the others were asleep and the fire had turned to glowing embers, I stayed awake, not out of fear or duty, but because the silence no longer scared me. It didn't feel like a void. It felt like a room, space, something waiting for me not to fill it, but to sit inside it without apology. So I did, and I cried, not out of sadness, out of release. What I promised myself before I lay down. I whispered one more thing to the air, to the stars, to the piece of me that had always listened. I won't forget you. but I also won't stay here forever. And I meant it, not because I was done grieving, not because the war had ended, but because the silence inside me had finally been heard. And that silence, that final, aching silence, was no longer waiting for permission. It had spoken, and I had listened, and now we could both rest. I still carried the silence. Silence never asked to leave me. It simply changed shape. It used to be an ache. Then it became a shadow. Now, something gentler. A presence, a space, a pause that lets me speak and breathe. And remember, without drowning. I still carry it, but not like I used to. The bench beneath. The tree, there's a bench at the edge of my yard. It leans a little. The paint is chipped. It groans when I sit on it. But it's mine. Every morning, I carry a cup of tea to that bench, okay? And I sit with the silence. The same silence that once haunted me in barracks, in trenches, in nights too quiet to trust out now. It watches the leaves move in slow choreography, waits for birds to land. It welcomes wind through the sleeves of my coat. We sit there, together, old friends, no words needed. 2. The box I finally opened years ago. I packed it all away. The letters, the pens, the photograph from the winter they surprised me with, a birthday candle, even the charcoal poem on a ration label. I couldn't look at it then, but time, it's patient, and sometimes silence isn't waiting to scream. So one afternoon, I opened the box, not quickly, not like ripping a bandage, but like opening a window that had been painted shut for years, and smiled because it didn't feel like pain anymore. It felt like proof. 3. The scarf that still smells like smoke. I kept one scarf. It's threadbare now, faded blue, smells like cedar and something older than that. Sometimes I wear it, not for warmth, but because it reminds me that there was a time when something that small felt like safety. I used to clutch it when I had nothing else. When orders ended and the sky grew heavy, now I wear it on quiet walks, and I let the breeze find me, not to test my strength, but to remind me I survived for the hours that belonged to Maine War. Time belongs to someone else. It's counted in whistles, marches, watches, synchronized before dawn. But now, it's mine. No one tells me when to rise or when to eat, okay? Or how long I'm allowed to grieve. So I take my hours slowly. I sip my tea until it cools, finish books in one sitting, or not at all. I stop walking to watch ants carry crumbs home. Time has softened, and in its hands, so have I the letters. I still write letters to people I lost. 2 versions of myself, 2 boys who never came back, 2 questions I never answered. I don't send them. I fold them, tuck them into an old wooden drawer, let them breathe in ink and memory. Because writing isn't just for communication, it's for continuing. And sometimes you don't need someone to read your words. You just need to know you had the courage to write them down. The feather on the grave Moloch's grave is simple. No rank, okay? No medal, just his name and the word home. I visit once a year. Always in spring, always with a feather I find. That day, he used to say, feathers were the soul's way of reminding us we're light. So I place one there. I tell him the things I forgot to say. Not apologies, it's just stories. Moments he would have smiled at in when I walk away, okay? The wind always lifts the feather slightly, as if nodding. 7. The sleep that doesn't fear night for years. I couldn't sleep unless the light was on, unless my back was to a wall, unless I knew with certainty that no one needed me in the next minute. But now, I sleep, not because I'm never afraid, because I no longer let fear write the ending. Sleep doesn't mean forgetting. It means trusting that rest is not a betrayal, that peace is not weakness, that dreams are not traps. They're invitations, and I accept them now, night after night, 8. The child that asked me why a limpet was in the market. A boy, no older than 7. He tugged his mother's coat and pointed at me. Why does that man walk like that? His mother hushed him, embarrassed, but I smiled, kneeled down, slow, steady, and said, because I walked a very long way to get here. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. That makes sense? Then he offered me his lollipop, and in that moment, I remembered what kindness feels like when it has no agenda, just presence. X. The bell that doesn't ring theirs. A bell above my door. Old brass, tarnished. It used to ring when the wind blew hard, loud, sudden, jarring. So I tied a bit of cloth inside it. Now, when the wind comes, the bell doesn't cry. It breathes, a soft hush. Okay? A reminder that not all movement has to be announced. Some of it is sacred, subtle, like healing, like peace, like the life you begin after everyone else stopped watching. X. What I say to the silence, now I still speak to it. Every day, not with fear, not with urgency, just with gratitude. I sit on the bench, wrap the scarf, hold the cup, watch the sky, and say, you stayed. Even when I couldn't, you waited. Even when I refused, you softened, and I finally let you in. The silence doesn't reply. It never did. But now I don't need it to, because I understand it, and it understands me. And in that space, no louder than a breath, we rest together. The end of the war inside the war doesn't vanish. It just stops demanding center stage. And the silence, it's not what we feared. It's not emptiness. It's capacity, a space for memory, a seat for pain, a canvas for healing. I still carry the silence, but now it carries me too. And wherever I go, whatever I forget, whatever time takes from me, this remains. I listened, spoke, I survived, and in that survival, I found something louder than war ever was. Peace. If any part of this story stayed with you, if any silence of his reminded you of your own, tell me in the comments, what kind of silence do you still carry, and how are you learning to listen to it? I read every message. I'll be there, not to fix, but to witness. Your silence matters here.